The prairie didn't whisper that morning. It stood still, watching. A sky of pewter and lavender hung low over the wheat-colored fields as Delaney Rose Whitaker stood beside the small grave her father had dug years ago with shaking hands and a worn-out shovel. The headstone leaned slightly, carved from sandstone and softened by time. Her bare feet sank into the cool dirt, toes curled against the earth like roots refusing to lift. She was tall, even by a ranch hand's standards, taller than most men in town, and certainly taller than any woman the boys of Dry Willow dared to dance with. The hem of her faded cotton dress clung to her calves as the wind stirred it lightly, and still she stood, straight-backed, quiet as cathedral. Her fingers brushed the top of the grave marker. "I ain't changed much, Pa," she whispered. "Still too much woman for one man to carry, I guess." She didn't cry. She never cried. In Dry Willow, Delaney wasn't known for her voice or her eyes or the curve of her hip. She was known for her height, for looming in the back of church pews, her bonnet brushing the top beam, for making men's pride buckle, for standing out like a steeple in a town full of barns. It wasn't just the height. It was how she held herself, as if apologizing for it, as if every inch of her had cost someone something. She saddled her mare Junebug with familiar silence, and rode into town as the sun cracked the clouds in golden shards. Her shadow stretched longer than the horses. At the Mercantile, Miss Clara Boone was sweeping the porch steps with slow, practiced rhythm. "Morning, Delaney," she said kindly, though her eyes flicked toward the windows behind her. Inside, folks noticed. They always noticed. Delaney stepped inside, ducking slightly. The bell chimed above her, and every head turned just slightly. Not rude, just cautious, like she might hear her head on the ceiling or their pride. Mrs. Everston, who sold butter and judgment in equal measure, leaned close to another woman. "So tall, poor thing," she murmured. "No wonder she's alone. Men don't marry women they have to look up to." Delaney pretended not to hear. She always did. She reached for a sack of oats, gripping it with callous hands. Her palms were the years of ranch work, not embroidery. Her shoulders had hauled hay, not lace. She paid in exact coins and left with her chin tucked low. Outside, Miss Clara stopped sweeping. "You ever notice the sky?" she asked, not looking up. Delaney frowned. "What about it?" "It don't care how tall you are. It just waits for someone to rise and meet it." Delaney almost smiled. Almost. The wind shifted as a horse clopped into town, a broad-shouldered chestnut mare with dust-flecked flanks and a rider in a worn hat. His frame slouched just enough to seem weary, not weak. He didn't say a word as he dismounted, didn't tie his reins like he was in a hurry. He moved with that rare kind of quiet that didn't need announcing. He looked like the kind of man who'd been places and chose stillness, not because he couldn't speak, but because most words didn't matter. Delaney watched him from the shade of the porch. He caught her eyes, just for a flicker of a moment, and tipped his hat. She looked away first. His name was Colt Mercer, though she didn't know that yet. He passed her with the faint smell of leather and tobacco leaf, and something old, like memory. He didn't pause, didn't gawk, just moved like the world hadn't narrowed itself to make room for her awkward silhouette. She didn't understand why that stung more than all the stares. That night, Delaney sat on the porch steps of her cabin, a mug of cold tea in her hand, untouched. The prairie stretched out before her, like an empty page she didn't know how to fill. Junebug snorted from the barn. An owl called somewhere near the cottonwoods. The silence wrapped itself around her, like a quilt sewn from loneliness and resignation. She remembered the barn dance. 2 years back, the music had been loud and wild, laughter rising into the rafters like wood smoke. Harlan Pitt had grabbed her hand, tried to spin her, and when she'd misstepped, he'd laughed loud enough to make the whole town turn. "Dance with a tree. You'll break your neck," he'd said, loud and proud. No man had asked since. She still remembered how the lantern light had made her shadow longer than the barn itself. She pulled the braid from her hair and let it fall loose over one shoulder. A few strands caught the moonlight. Her fingers hovered above her lips. She wondered, briefly, what it might be like to be kissed not out of pity, not in secret, but like she was something worth waiting for. The wind stirred again. Out in the distance, A lone horse called, and she thought again of the stranger with the soft eyes and dust on his boots. Maybe he'd leave like the others. Maybe he wouldn't. Either way, she didn't dare hope. Not yet. But as she rose from the steps and looked up at the sky, she realized she wasn't ducking anymore. And somewhere inside her, something stood taller than she'd ever dared. The first time Colt Mercer spoke to Delaney Rose Whitaker, it was over a fallen bag of sugar. The sack had split open on the mercantile steps, spilling white crystals like early snow across the wood. Delaney crouched down, flustered, brushing her skirt aside as she tried to gather the mess with bare hands. Her cheeks burned. 2 boys snickered nearby, watching her scramble. Too tall, too flustered, too much, again. Then a shadow moved in beside her. A large, callous hand gently scooped up a mound of sugar and poured it back into broken sack. Colt didn't speak at first. He simply knelt beside her, wordless and steady, as if the moment needed no commentary. She glanced sideways. He was close enough for her to notice the faded scar, just below his left ear, the stubble that didn't quite cover the hollows in his jaw. His eyes were the color of river stones, gray and still. "Won't save much of it," he said finally, softly. "Doesn't matter," she replied, her voice small. But he looked at her then, really looked, and said, "Still worth trying, ain't it?" Delaney blinked. No one had ever said something like that to her. About sugar, about effort, about anything. After that, they started seeing each other by accident, or maybe on purpose, though neither would admit it. She passed him near the well one afternoon, hauling buckets with strong arms and a bent back. He tipped his hat. She nodded. Nothing more. Another time. She found him at the edge of the meadow, watching the wind ripple through the tall grass like it carried stories. He didn't ask her to stay, but she did. They stood in companionable silence, and that silence said more than most conversations. Delaney started noticing things she hadn't before. How he always walked with his shoulders slightly forward, like someone who expected to be pushed. How he fixed fences slower than most men, but with a precision that made the posts outlast 2 storms. How he always left his boots just outside the church steps, even when it was cold, like he believed sacred things deserved clean floors. She also noticed how he never flinched when people stared at her, never looked away awkwardly, or tried to explain her presence with small talk. He just stood there beside her, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. One morning, she left a jar of blackberry preserves on his porch. No note, no expectations. The next day, she found a small wooden comb carved from mesquite on the seat of her saddle, smooth, simple, and strong, just like him. At church, Pastor Ebtanner began to preach with a particular weight to his words. "Women ought to know their place," he intoned one Sunday, voice thick with honeyed judgment. "Not all things that grow tall are fruitful." The congregation murmured in approval. Delaney felt the weight of every eye. Outside, her steps were quick, her head down. But Colt was waiting. He didn't speak, just stepped into her path, steady and tall. She looked up, lips trembling, hands clenched. "It's not your fight." His jaw twitched. "Maybe it should be." The wind pulled at her braid. She didn't take his hand, even though he offered it, but she stared at it, long enough to memorize the way his fingers curled, patient and sure, never demanding. That night, she stared at herself in the cracked mirror above her wash basin. Her reflection was familiar, too familiar, tall, angular, plain. But something was different. Not her face, not her bones. Her spine, she wasn't hunched. She wore her height like armor now. The next time they met, it was beneath the cottonwood tree behind the schoolhouse. She brought fresh cornbread in a cloth-wrapped basket. He brought 2 peaches, soft and bruised, but sweet enough to make her lips sticky. They talked more that day. About horses, about fences, about the way the sky seemed bigger in dry willow than anywhere else. "Ever been to the canyon in bloom?" he asked, picking at the seam of his glove. She shook her head. Never had reason to go. He smiled then, not wide, but real. "Wildflowers there grow taller than your waist. Reckon they don't mind." Delaney laughed. She couldn't help it. It wasn't the prettiest sound, but it was honest. He looked at her like it was the most beautiful thing he'd ever heard. Word spread. Of course. Towns are small that way. People watched the two of them with the kind of scrutiny usually reserved for saloon fights or Sunday baptisms. Mrs. Everston clucked her tongue. He'll leave. They always do. Miss Clara just folded her arms and said, maybe this time someone stays. Still, the doubt crept in like water through floorboards. One evening, Delaney rode out past the ridge. The sun dipped low, turning the fields to bronze. She didn't expect to find him there, alone, mending his saddle strap, his back to the wind. She didn't speak. Neither did he. But when she dismounted, he glanced up and smiled like she'd been expected all along. You ever think, she began softly, that maybe some folks weren't built for town life? He tilted his head. Maybe towns weren't built for the right kind of folks. They sat side by side, her boots nearly touching his. The silence wasn't awkward. It was rich, full of things that didn't need saying. Why'd you come here? She asked after a while. He looked at the sky. To stop running. From what? He didn't answer, not directly. Just said, from places that made me feel small. She turned to him. And now, he met her eyes. Now I look up. The sky stretched above them, wide and full of stars. Back in town, the dance flyers had gone up. Another barn dance. Another chance for the world to laugh. Delaney saw the poster nailed to the church post and felt the old fear stir. Her feet itched to turn away. That night, Miss Clara visited with a bundle wrapped in linen. A dress, deep blue with embroidered cuffs. It was your mama's, she said. She wore it when she kissed your father for the first time. Delaney ran her fingers over the fabric. It wasn't the dress that scared her. It was the hope. On the night of the dance, she walked in alone. Heads turned. Mouths whispered. But she didn't shrink. Colt saw her from across the barn. His breath caught. For a moment, everything, the fiddles, the stomping boots, the laughter, faded into stillness. He crossed the room slowly, deliberately. When he reached her, he didn't speak, just held out his hand, palm up, steady as ever. And this time, she took it. They stepped into the music, and she felt her body relax into his rhythm. He didn't lead like he owned her. He moved with her, matched her pace, made space for her height, her strength, her shape. Her feet didn't fumble. Her laugh came freely. She wasn't the tallest girl in the room. She was a woman who danced like she belonged to the stars. When the music slowed, he pulled her close, not forcefully, but reverently, as if every inch of her mattered. And then, with the whole town watching, Colt Mercer bent his head and kissed Delaney Rose Whitaker like she was heaven itself. He didn't rush, didn't pull away quickly. He kissed her slow, like time had waited just for them. And when he whispered, "Been waiting to do that since the sugar spilled," she laughed into his chest, tears gathering in the corners of her eyes. Outside, the wind shifted, and somewhere far off, wildflowers bloomed, tall, untamed, and unashamed. The days after the dance unfolded like pages in a half-remembered novel. Soft, sun-warmed, edged in gold. Delaney Rose Whitaker moved through town with a new kind of quiet. Not the hush of shame or caution, but the peace of someone no longer hiding. Her boots struck the earth with purpose. Her shoulders no longer curved in apology. And when she caught her reflection in the mercantile window, she didn't flinch. People still stared. But the whispers had changed their shape. Not quite approval. Not yet, but curiosity. Wonder, even, how a woman like that, tall and alone and long dismissed, had found herself in the arms of the quiet cowboy who once never spoke a word to anyone. Colt Mercer didn't change much. Outwardly, he still walked slow, talked less, and nodded more than he smiled. But there was a glimmer in his eye now, like he'd found a fire to warm his hands by and didn't mind if it burned him. They saw each other most days. Not always for long. A shared biscuit behind the stable. A ride out past the ridge where the grass grew wild. Sometimes just a hand brushing a sleeve as they passed. Small things, but sacred. Nothing in dry willow moved fast, and neither did they. But inside Delaney, something had begun to ache, not painfully, but persistently, like the pulse of something long buried waking up and wondering if it could bloom. She didn't know if it was love. Not yet, but it was close enough to make her fingers tremble when she reached for him. Still, there were shadows. One morning, as they loaded lumber behind the church for a new fence, Pastor Tanner approached. He watched them a long moment, lips pursed, eyes sharp. Then he said, loud enough for others to hear, "A woman's duty is to be modest in all things. Pride cometh before the fall, Miss Whitaker." Delaney's face flushed. Her hand froze on the timber. But Colt stepped between them with the quiet fury of a rising tide. "She's not proud," he said. "She's just done apologizing for standing tall." Tanner's mouth snapped shut. He turned on his heel, and the moment passed like thunder rolling out across the hills. But that night, Delaney sat on her porch with her arms wrapped around her knees. The stars blinked above, indifferent and eternal. She heard Colt's boots on the gravel before she saw him. "You think they're right?" she asked without turning. He sat beside her, close but not pressing. "I think folks fear what don't fit easy in their box." She nodded. "I've been trying to fit since I was 12. He leaned forward, elbows on knees. "And how's that worked out?" Her laugh came bitter, about as well as sugar in a storm. He looked at her then, really looked, as if memorizing the planes of her face, the light in her eyes, the crack in her voice. "You don't need to fit, Delaney. You just need to be." A long silence stretched between them, filled only by the rustle of cottonwoods and the low creak of wood under shifting weight. Then he said, quieter than before, "Come with me tomorrow." "Where?" "Somewhere that don't ask you to shrink." She hesitated, heart stumbling. "I don't know if I know how to be in places like that." "You will," he said. "I'll take you." At sunrise, they rode out together, past the familiar fence lines, past the town's judgment, past everything small and heavy. The land opened up in great rows of wheat and sage. Birds flitted through low brush, and the air smelled like morning and dew. By midday, they reached the canyon. It wasn't grand like the painted deserts to the south. It was quieter, worn by time, not spectacle. But in its belly bloomed a riot of wildflowers, red, gold violet, tall as her hips and stubborn as thornwood. They grew in clusters and tangles, bursting from cracks in stone as if refusing to stay buried. Delaney stood at the edge, stunned. The sun lit her from behind, setting her hair ablaze. The wind tugged gently at her dress. Colt watched her silently, breath caught somewhere between awe and reverence. She stepped forward into the field, tall among the tall, her fingers grazing petals like silk. She turned slowly, her mouth parting. Not to speak, but to breathe differently, deeper, like the weight she carried had finally loosened its grip. Colt moved toward her, his steps careful, his gaze never wavering. "They're wild," she said, tears trembling on her lashes. "They're not supposed to be here." He reached out and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. "Neither are you," he said. "And yet look at you." She looked up at him. The height difference no longer felt like a shame. It felt like balance. Like two puzzle pieces long denied the chance to touch. And then, in that quiet place full of riotous life, he kissed her. He didn't ask. He didn't hesitate. His hands framed her face like she was made of sacred stone. His mouth met hers slow and deep, and something inside her uncoiled, something old and frightened and finally free. The kiss wasn't perfect. It was tender, clumsy in its aching honesty. Soft with a world had always been hard. But it felt like truth. It felt like home. When he pulled back, she didn't speak. She simply rested her forehead against his and let the tears fall. That night, they camped beneath the canyon rim. The fire was small but warm. He watched her while she braided her hair, and she watched him watch, both of them quiet and full. "I was never kissed like that before," she said. Colt stirred the coals. "How were you kissed before?" She shrugged, like it was something stolen, or something owed. He nodded slowly. Then they didn't know what they held. She reached across the space and took his hand. It was rough and steady and warm. "And you do?" "I do," he said. "Every inch. Every moment." She smiled then, not shyly, but fully, like the woman she was always meant to be. They stayed until morning. When they returned, Delaney didn't lower her gaze. She walked taller, not because of him, but because of herself, because something in her had shifted. The way flowers lean toward the sun, the way rivers carve canyons, not with force, but with persistence. The town didn't change overnight, but it noticed. People started saying her name differently, with a little less pity, a little more weight. Colt stayed. He fixed up the barn just outside town, painted the porch rail white, put up a sign that read Mercer and Whitaker, Horses and Honey. She sold jam. He trained colts. They didn't make a fuss about being together. They just were. And in the years that followed, folks told stories about the tall woman who walked like wind and the quiet cowboy who never let go of her hand, about the kiss that happened in a canyon full of wildflowers, about how sometimes you don't find love where it fits. You find it where it rises to meet you. Because some things, some people aren't made to shrink. They're made to stand tall and be loved for it. And maybe that's the kind of love we're all waiting for. The kind that doesn't ask us to change, just to bloom.